Hello, I'm Stephen Bauman. Welcome to this video. I'm going to talk to you today about color mixing in oil paint and the color theory that is involved in that practice. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to recreate a theoretical color wheel with the actual oil colors on your palette. This exercise is going to demonstrate the differences in between what you're capable of producing and what the full gamut of color actually is. All of the vocabulary and concepts that you see me put into practice in this video are introduced in a previous video on my YouTube channel, which, if you're a total beginner, is definitely going to be useful for you moving forward. Just follow the link on screen and it'll take you right to that video.
I think the easiest thing that we can do is really start with red. Essentially, nothing's going to get more red than the vermilion that I have. So that's really quite an easy one. After that, I'm going to try and make a slightly higher key version of yellow up here. So I'm taking a little bit of my yellow, brown, and white. Mimic the value of the yellow that we find on our traditional color wheel. So that's two primaries down. And of course, my cobalt blue will be a perfect third primary. Again, nothing that I can use will get any more blue than that cobalt. After that, we want our secondaries. Let's start with orange. Now, like I said before, this vermilion is already biased towards orange, which this is another word that I want you to keep in mind. Color bias reveals the true personality of the color, which is to say, yes, the hue of this vermilion is red, but it's a red that, if compared to cadmium red, would show that it has an influence of yellow in it rather than an influence that is either neutrally primary or even biased towards blue like an alizarin crimson might be. So I want to compare this now to each of these and see if I can find a way to get right into the middle. We need a little bit more yellow-brown. The next up is going to be green. So I'm going to take my cobalt blue, yellow-brown, try to mix up a hue that essentially sits in the middle of those two. I think this is the first secondary color that's going to reveal some of the limitations of this palette. This is only ever going to be so chromatic of a green. For instance, if you were going to go outside and landscape paint, I would say probably these two colors here are not going to reveal the greens that you truly want. In that case, I would substitute in or just add to the palette a cadmium yellow and maybe even a phthalo blue, depending upon how expressive I wanted my greens to be. I think this, though, is tilted a little bit too much towards yellow. I'm going to add a little bit more blue to it to try and sit right in the middle in between those two colors. Now we're on to finding our third secondary color. That's going to be violet. In fact, if I'm totally honest, we're finding a much more chromatic violet than I thought that we would using these pigments. This is, of course, because the red that I'm using is biased towards yellow, which is, of course, the complement of violet. That being said, this doesn't stand up well to dioxazine purple, ultimately in terms of the intensity of its chroma. But this is the violet that we're able to get using this palette. Next, we're on to the tertiary colors. Yellow-orange. And I'm mixing this by simply altering the proportion of each of these colors that I'm taking. Just like when you're comparing values, it's important to compare the color you're mixing to the two that you're trying to get in between to be able to make an objective observation about the accuracy of that mixture. Now on to red-orange, red-violet. Another thing you're going to notice while you're doing this is that different pigments have different tinting strengths. So to make a red-violet, I'm mixing together a cobalt and a vermilion. Between these two pigments, the vermilion extra is a much stronger tinting pigment, and so I have to use less of it to achieve a greater effect. It's something that when I'm choosing a palette to paint with, I try to be aware of. I would like to have each pigment that I choose on here to have as close to the same tinting strength as possible. I say this only because it's more convenient when you're mixing up colors in between with your brush and so on. We've all had like a pile of English red on our palette and we've dipped like one bristle of our brush into it, put it into the mixture, and it's like an eruption of a volcano of red into the color that we're making. It's highly inconvenient. Now, this is a color whose chroma has truly suffered with this palette. Our red-violet really reads just as brown. The blue-violet, on the other hand, winds up being pretty radiant. Really nice. Then we're going on to blue-green. Lots of cobalt, just a little bit of yellow-brown. And finally, we're on to yellow-green. Now this is a very simple and essential color wheel that we've created. You can see the pure pigments here have been mixed out to express all of the different variations that we can find of our primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. Among the conclusions that we can draw is that our palette is particularly weak in the red-violet area, that our yellow has a strong bias towards orange, as our red has a strong bias towards yellow. Overall, though, there's actually a pretty beautiful harmony of all these colors. Oh, by the way, of course, our greens. We could use a little bit more chroma there. If we were actually going to go out and try and paint a tree outside, it would be a disaster. So this is my palette for indoor painting. We're talking portraiture, most still lifes that maybe don't contain a lemon or a green silk cloth, and would also be perfectly fine for figure painting. The next thing that we're going to explore is how complementary colors work in oil paint. Now you may find yourself in a situation where you're painting a model with red hair, and you take your vermilion pigment here, and you find, well, her hair is not really exactly that chromatically red. It is a reduced chroma. How do I get this red to be a little bit less intense without simply adding gray to it? Here then is the notion of a complementary color being used to reduce the chroma of a particular mixture. I'm going to take a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow, and add those to this red, and we're going to start to reduce how colorful that red is. I'm going to take a little bit more. We're going to reduce this even further. Something you're going to notice, though, is that we're also reducing the value. So we're making this a darker value when compared to our pure red pigment. Now let's say that I would like to achieve the exact same value just at a lower chroma. What I would have to do then is compensate, in this case, by adding a little bit of white. It's also worth noting that white will also tend to decrease the chroma of the mixture. This is simply by virtue of proportion in the sense that white does not itself have chroma. So by adding to the mixture something that lacks chroma, we are decreasing the proportion of chromatic pigment that we're using. It's still dark. Now there's probably a little bit of difference left in between these two in terms of value. But I just want to review really quick what we went through in selecting this color. We wanted something that had a dominant hue of red. We wanted it to be the same value as the original pigment, vermilion extra, but we wanted it to have a reduced chroma. We assessed the hue, value, and chroma that we were looking for in making this particular mixture. We used green, which is the complement to red, in order to reduce the chroma. We used white to tint it upwards in order to achieve the correct value. So with these three questions, we have triangulated the location in a 3D color space of exactly this mixture.
To practice these concepts further, there's one particular exercise that I think is really, really useful, and it's that of color matching. If you want to learn about that and all the rest of the stuff that I have to say about color theory and color practice, you can subscribe at my Patreon page to the Atelier tier level. There's a link in the description of this video to take you there, and you'll have access to those lessons and all the other stuff that is on my Patreon page. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the content on this channel, please remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.